so much, Anna. I'm just hoping that people can see my screen. So you might just let me know if the slideshow has come up. Wonderful. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Anna. And thanks so much for this introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. And I'm thrilled to be back working with Surrey Virtual School. Would have worked with the team at Surrey a number of years ago, and it's just fabulous to be back with what feels like a whole new fresh team and a lot of innovative things that are happening. So that's wonderful. As Anna mentioned, my name is Stephanie O'Malley, and I'm the founder and trained as an education psychologist. So I'll mention a little bit more about that later on. Just to say on a technical side as well, we have Vanessa online with us from our team. So if people are having difficulties, technical difficulties or any issues, just put in the chat, or you can let Vanessa know and she will be on hand. And Anna's quite right if the videos could stay off, but just to mention the microphones, if you do want to chip in or there's something you want to ask, you're welcome to turn them on. If it gets too busy, we might leave them till the end, but we'll try a little bit of interactivity. It is quite a big group, but it's great to have a bit of interactivity. Please comment and ask questions in the chat box at any time, and we'll be keeping an eye on that as well. So, participation from you is definitely welcome if we can manage it. And it's wonderful to see so many schools interested and getting involved in this whole area. So thank you for being here. So just to give an overview of, I suppose, what the workshop aims to cover, and you would have got this, I suppose, in the registration process. And what we're looking at really is looking from a broader level of what causes us to flip our lid. So not just ourselves, but also the children that we work with and the young people that we work with. So when I talk about DESTY and the program and the training that we have, the island itself that we work with, usually primary school, so key stage 2 up till about 11, 12. But the resilience course, which we're going to talk about later on, the online resilience course, that really is for anybody in any age. And the best thing about the resilience course is that you learn so many tools and strategies for yourself, which we'll see is very, very important. So for this hour, I'm hoping you'll find some practical information, some new information, hopefully, or it'll reconfirm or refresh information or training that you've had before. The first area is about what, as I said, what causes us to flip our lid. Why does the brain react in a really strong way? Why is it more so for some than for others? We're also going to look at the whole area of the impact of trauma and toxic stress, and looking at how that affects over the lifespan from an early age right through until adults, and how it impacts so many aspects of our lives, and also relation to that toxic stress, which a lot of people, young and old, particularly during this COVID period and the restrictions that have been imposed, has generated for sure a lot more toxic stress for all of us, and just the impact of that. And then towards the end, I'll be telling you a little bit about the funded program that is being offered in partnership with ourselves and the team at Surrey Virtual School. So if you like, this afternoon is a taster for some of the information that feeds into a much bigger course on developing children's emotional resilience, which is an online course, and where Surrey Virtual School have funded a number of packages for carers and for educators, whatever role you're in the school. So that, again, something I'll detail towards the end of the webinar. Please chip in questions, comments as we go along, and I'll do my best to keep an eye, and Vanessa will interrupt if I'm missing something that needs to be addressed. So please, by all means, interrupt me if you like. So as I mentioned, Stephanie O'Malley is my name. I developed the program, the DESTY Island Emotional Resilience Program, and that involves 2 parts training at level 1 with a background understanding about attachment trauma and really taking trauma-informed approach to supporting young people. And then the level 2 is about actually becoming the certified DESTY mentor, so you can implement the online program, emotional resilience program, which is DESTY Island. I have a background in working with young people in care, people with intellectual disabilities, people with severe emotional and social challenges, and young people with a range of educational and learning needs as well. But my passion has always been around building emotional resilience and well-being, and that's where my vision for developing DESTY Island and the training that we offer comes from. So just looking at the first area that I'd like to cover this morning, this afternoon, we had a session this morning with a fabulous group of carers as well. So, it's great to see that level of engagement. So this information will have filtered through to the carers and yourselves. In terms of this term, flipping our lid, I just realized actually my video isn't on, apologies. I meant to turn that on, apologies. Just in terms of flipping our lid, this is a phrase that was coined by Dan Siegel, who is a neuroscientist and child psychiatrist in the States. And he's done a lot of work on the area of trauma and how the brain is affected. along with lots of other people as well. But he used that phrase, which I find really useful. And even though it's not something that we might use in our everyday language, flipping our lid, we might find other ways of communicating that. Most people know what it means when you say they completely flip their lid, or I flip my lid, or whatever it might be. So it's a useful term, but it has a very strong neurological basis, and it actually explains a lot to us when we unpack why and what we do when we flip our lid. So the first part of understanding this whole concept is just having an understanding of how the brain works at a very basic level. And the way I like to introduce this is looking at this model by an evolutionary scientist who became a neuroscientist, Paul MacLean, who developed this idea of the brain having three core parts. And he takes it from really looking at our evolution from when we're reptiles at the very beginning of evolution, and bringing us right through to when we became mammals, and then to becoming who we are and the Homo sapiens, or human beings, we are today. And when he looked at the pattern of brain development, it broke down very neatly into three core areas. Now, of course, the brain is a complex organ. There are millions of neural connections and, wiring and firing that's going on. So, bearing all of that in mind, this model still has stood the test of time. So he first came up with it in the 60s. In the 90s, it became popularized, and now it is embedded in so many studies and in so many theories around the brain and how it works, and particularly in relation to how we emotionally regulate and how we cope with life's challenges and how we can learn from experiences and build our resilience. So this is something that you learn much more about in the emotional resilience training course. So this is sort of a taster to give you just a little sense of what's included, and again, hopefully you'll take something really meaningful from it and practical. So when Paul MacLean looked at the brain, there were three core elements of the brain. And the first part he noticed was at the very, very early stages, we had what was called the reptilian brain. And it was quite small, and it had one primary function, and that was really just to keep us alive. So the purpose of this part of our brain, even today, is to sense threats or risks in our environment, and to send a message to other parts of our brain so that we act in some way that keeps us safe and helps us to survive. So again, at a very early stage of evolution, it was primarily a physical threat. So really core tools in that time were our senses, picking up from our environment if something was coming to attack us, if there was a threat that could threaten our survival. And when we noticed that there was a threat, or our senses picked up a threat, it sent a message to the next part of the brain, which was much, much smaller at that time. It was there, but it was much smaller, which is the limbic, or the feeling brain. And the feeling brain, or the limbic brain, is there in order to help us to form relationships, in order to have bonds, in order to play, be creative. So when everything is going well, there's no threats in our environment, the reptilian brain is doing what it's designed to do, which, including picking up threats from our environment, is there to keep our heart rate steady, keep our breathing steady, keep our temperature in our body regulated, all those physiological survival basic needs. So when everything is ticking over, everything is in balance, and the limbic brain is there to help us to connect and to help us to understand relationships and to be able to connect with other people. What happens when the reptilian brain is activated, if you like, is a particular part of the brain called the amygdala. It's like our little alarm system. What happens when we pick up a threat? As a reptile, it would generally be to our physical environment. As we have become more sophisticated and our brain has become more complex, it's not just physical threat, it's emotional threat, it's psychological threat, it can even be social threat. So once something is picked up that something's not right, the alarm bell is sent off, then a message goes straight to the limbic brain, which says, okay, there's something happening here. And depending on the level of threat that is registered, the limbic brain will typically go into that stress response mode. And in the stress response mode, and most of you know this, there's three typical default behaviors. So there's fight, where if we think that we can challenge whatever the threat is, then we will come out fighting. If we think that we can't fight it, but we can get away from it, then we will flee. So if we think we can outrun it, or if we feel we can't outrun it and we can't fight it off, then we'll flee, or we will hide and try and avoid. We'll freeze, or we'll hide, or just try and avoid having to interact in any way in order to sustain ourselves. So that is when we're in a stressed mode, and that can be a really useful mechanism even now. So the example I give for that is, for example, if you're driving a car and something comes out really suddenly, you need to decide in a nanosecond what I need to do here. And that's why these two parts of the brain are really old. They work really effectively when they're working in the right circumstances, and they work hand in hand. So they really do communicate very, very quickly. The third part of the brain that comes up then is the thinking brain. This developed much, much later, and this is when we became, I suppose, sophisticated as human beings, if you like, and this is when we needed more faculties to evolve. So to problem solve, we developed language, we developed our will, creative thinking, all of those things. And this part of the brain is where our true intelligence, if you like, lies, and what separates us from all other mammals and reptiles. And the important thing to know about this brain is that it's much newer. It's easier to change because it's learning all the time and networks are forming all of the time. But the other thing is that because it's newer, it takes a little longer for it to kick in, particularly in times of stress or in a very traumatic or stressful situation that has to be dealt with. And again, there's good reason for that. So if you take the example of driving in a car, I think it says it's about 9/10 of a second it takes for the thinking brain to kick in when something has been activated, when that alarm has gone off. So if you're driving in the car and something shoots out, you may not have 9/10 of a second to pause and say, do I beep on the horn to let them know that I'm here? Do I swerve out of the way, or do I hit on the brakes and freeze? So you need to act in that moment because it's critical for your survival. So that's when it works really well, and when all of them come in a situation of real stress or crisis, and you need that to happen. The challenge is that when somebody has been through trauma or toxic stress, which we will look at in a couple of minutes, that reptilian part of the brain is very alert, it's hypervigilant, and it's all the time scanning and perceiving threats in the environment, whether they're there or they're not. So what you have is that the brain is in a reactive mode with the limbic part of the brain as well, constantly waiting to react because that's what it feels it needs to do to survive. And in that situation, unfortunately, the thinking brain is given very little opportunity to come online, to help them to learn from their experience, and to be able to help them to problem solve in the moment, or to just take that 9/10 of a second to pause and see what's actually going on. So as I said, it's a really, really helpful model of the brain. There's a lovely resource from Beacon House. I mentioned this in the morning webinar, and people were saying the fabulous resources that are there in Beacon House, handouts and downloads and all of that. So I really do encourage you to have a look at that. And they give lovely resources for free to be used for training or just for your own information. So again, it's just giving that sense that there is those three parts of the brain. They all have a role to play. When we're in balance, when we're not traumatized, when we're not under pressure or stress, they work really well together and they help us to achieve our potential and build resilience. Where we are going through a stressful period, where there's been trauma, where we are in that, as we look at the survival loop, stuck in that reptilian brain, then we are not as effective. And in fact, it can have really serious repercussions or implications for us later in life as well. So how does that link to this idea of flipping your lid? Well, this is where Dan Siegel came up with a really useful, practical model that's really good for you to know about. I would love if this afternoon or this evening or in the next week, you had the opportunity to share this model with your partner, with a family relative, with somebody that you know, and particularly if you could share this model with a young person. I've shared this model with children from all ages and teenagers and other adults, and it's really, really useful. And the reason it's so practical is because it's using literally your hand, which you have available to explain at any time that the opportunity arises. And so the example is that the lower part of the brain, if you take the hands up, the lower part of the hand and the brain are represented here by obviously the wrist and the arm and the bottom of the hand. If you bring your thumb across, you're bringing in the limbic brain, which sits right in the center, and then fold over the fingers. And then you see that's the thinking brain sitting on top. And your fingernails there is what would represent maybe the executive functioning skills. That's the real intelligence, real higher order thinking skills. So as I said, when everything is going well, when everything is, there's no threats in the environment, there's no serious pressure or stress on, this all works in a very integrated way and is able to respond to situations if they arise rather than reacting. What happens from this model, when there is a stressor or a trigger or some trauma has been activated, what happens is the alarm bell goes off, and that activates the limbic part of the brain, which literally kicks, not literally, but in essence, it kicks the thinking brain offline. And that is when somebody has flipped their lid. And that's for ourselves in situations that might have happened, or for the young people or the adolescents that, or the children that we work with. And that's when you see somebody really losing it. If you think of the driving example, somebody, road rage, somebody might have maybe, come in front of somebody, it mightn't have been very serious. But for somebody who's in a very stressed state, who's been through trauma and who finds it hard to regulate their emotions, then the reaction can be really strong and actually go on to cause another accident or make a far bigger potential risk than there would have been with whatever happened. So it's those examples where somebody has lost it. And for me, when we're thinking of children and young people and we're working with them, it is about understanding that when they have flipped their lid, when they have got to that point where they've kicked the thinking brain online, the least useful thing you can do in that moment is try and engage their thinking brain, because they're not able to access it. So when you use language, if you ask questions about what's going on, if you try and remind them of their strategies, or say, remember you did this before and you said you wouldn't do it again, any of those things in that moment is literally like putting fire on a petrol. And where the person is already overloaded and completely overwhelmed, those extra demands, those verbal demands, even a judgmental kind of a stance or an attitude, that can all just cause more of a trigger for the behavior and for the emotions, and make it harder for that young person to calm. Now, it's not to say that obviously you can accept any behavior, or, if they do something really destructive, or for example, they throw something or they hurt somebody, of course, that's not okay. But the point is, it's around keeping them safe and everybody else safe in the first instance, and waiting for them to be able to calm initially. Now, after that event, obviously there has to be points of reflection and trying to learn from the experience, and potentially consequences if that's called for. But it's just to recognize that when we're dealing with young people, that flipping the lid, once they've gone, and we can all think, I'm sure, of an occasion in our lives when something has happened that just completely triggered us, and afterwards you're very sorry about it. You see the young people, they're very sorry, they know what they should have done, they know they promise they won't do it again. But the challenge is, if they're stuck in that survival loop and they don't, and they're not giving themselves the opportunity to bring their thinking brain online, then they're just caught in the same reactive behaviors. And oftentimes it's down to what they have seen role model for them, or it's just what has worked effectively for them in the past, and that's why they rely on them. So flipping the lid is literally the process that leads to emotions over being overwhelmed by emotions, or where anger actually explodes from a young person. So just as a point of reflection, and this is the thing about the level 1 emotional resilience course that has been funded, the more extensive one, we do, as part of the course, it's about trying to understand ourselves a little bit and understand how all this information relates to all of us at different times, and then applying that to the young people, and particularly those who have been through very traumatic or very negative early life experiences, or life experiences at any stage. So it's really useful to think about these things, not just in context of young people, but ourselves. And it's just, for me, I always try and think of triggers. There's lots of triggers I've had. I think through the training I've developed and I've learned and researched, I've become a bit more regulated. Not to say I don't flip my lid from time to time, but thinking about in the past, things like somebody coming to call and the house is in a mess and I'm just in a tizzy, and it's like I'm panicking and things are being flown all over the place, and the family know just to kind of maybe keep their distance and there's no talking to me. So that's just a simple example, but there can be lots of things. It could be somebody using a particular phrase, or if you're trying to explain something to somebody, or tell them how you're feeling and they're interrupting, or they're trying to problem solve. It can be any number of things, but it's recognizing this can happen and does happen to everybody at some stage. But it's recognizing that for some people, where they've been through a situation that has made them feel the need to be hyper vigilant and keep themselves safe by, reacting to their environment so that they can control things. It's just important to recognize it's just a more extreme level of what we can all experience and what we can all have. So just as a check-in point there, I'm just wondering, can people relate to that? If you want to use a chat box, can people relate to that? And does it make sense? And do you see this happening in young people and yourselves? So any comments on that, flipping your lid? Lovely, thank you, Nicola. You can relate to that. Super. And that's why, sometimes young people or children look quite calm. They come in, they're in great form. You say they're at kind of, naught or whatever, on the scale, they seem very settled in themselves. and something happens, and it might seem so small. Somebody takes a pencil, or somebody says something, or whatever it might be, somebody looks the wrong way, and suddenly they've gone, they say, from 0 to 100. And it's like, where did that come out of? But as an educator said to me before, a lot of these children are not coming in at 0. They're coming in at 90 or 95. And while they're holding it, that's why it's very little that takes them to 100. And it's exactly right. And it's why you sometimes think there's a Jekyll and Hyde. They're fine, they're fine, they're fine. And then this other person comes out. And because the thinking brain has been taken offline, they can't communicate what is happening. And they find it hard to communicate and to take information from you in terms of why this is happening. I loved all the comments coming in here. Fantastic. I see this particularly more recently with families of stressed and anxious. Helen, you're so right. And we can't dismiss the impact of COVID and the restrictions. And in situations where if we hadn't this to deal with in the last 14 or 15 months, we probably wouldn't see the level. And some families and some young people, we wouldn't see it in. But it's been a consequence of what we've had to deal with. Definitely have been many people at this point flipping. Yeah, Joanne, and I think this term for schools in particular has been incredibly challenging, and for carers and for parents. Trying to settle them back this term has been really, really difficult. Great, guys. Yes, 100%. And then can relate to this with the students and also a family member, exactly, and ourselves. I think it's really effective. Brilliant. Sometimes I've claimed and regulated, but I haven't actually, and can be triggered quite easily again. Absolutely. And I can relate to this with students. Brilliant. So that's fantastic. So it's lovely that this resonates and makes sense for you. And that hand model of the brain, when somebody is calm and they're trying to understand why they do it, and they're so upset, it's trying to explain that this is what's happened. It happens to us all. And we need to find a way, how can we calm this part of the brain? So if somebody does say something or take something, that we can actually understand that and bring our thinking brain online. So brilliant. You've used it in parenting workshops, Rachel, and you've had great response. Absolutely, parents and carers benefit hugely as much as ourselves. So looking at this whole area now of trauma and toxic stress, and this is a model that's come from Harvard University, and I like the way they break down stress in this way, because stress can be positive or negative. Years ago I was looking at stress as like, all stress is unnecessary, all stress is bad. But actually, when you reframe it and you see that there can be a positive stress, example I always give is, for me, every time I come onto one of my live workshops or webinars, I always have that bit of positive stress. So my palms are a little warmer, my throat is a little bit dry, I can feel my heart rate, my breathing a little faster. So it's always the case. I'm worrying a little, will you enjoy the webinar? Will it go well? Will we have technical issues? Will there be value in what I'm saying? And that always happens. And for me, it keeps me sharp, it keeps me awake, and I'm here and ready to respond to you. And at the end of it, I feel great that I've done it. And generally, if it's gone well, I'm delighted as well. So positive stress is important in our lives. And it's a good thing, and it helps us to build resilience. And if you think of young people, it's around supporting them to move outside of their comfort zone and recognize that something might feel a little bit scary, something might not be something that they want to necessarily do, but that once they do it, they'll have that sense of achievement and that confidence afterwards. It can be things like riding a bike, going to a new place, meeting new people, any of those things that once they're supported and encouraged to step into that stretch zone, just beyond their comfort zone, can be so beneficial to them, and often is. The next level of stress then is tolerable stress. And that's something where it's a little bit more serious. And it's something that kind of does shake up a person, or could potentially lead to trauma. But it's generally short-lived. So I always give the example of in our house a number of years ago, we had a horrendous storm that swept through the house. And my daughter was 3 at the time, and she was in a room on her own where the windows had blown out, the doors had blown in, and we couldn't get into her for a short period of time, but it felt like a long period of time. And it had huge ramifications for her for a number of months afterwards, where she wouldn't open a window or a door. She would flip her lid if she saw a leaf blowing outside. It was really challenging for a while, but she was very fortunate. We were fortunate with the people around her. We, I suppose, had some sense of how to support her. Her preschool were amazing. There was an outdoor preschool. Everybody who she was in contact with understood and were very, very supportive. And we've been able to use that example with her now. She's now 8, nearly 8. Anytime she goes through a difficult time, or she's really challenged by something, we say, remember that time and how difficult that was, and how you moved through that, and how that doesn't bother you anymore. And that's how we support her to know that her resilience has built and is there. The key thing about tolerable stress when something happens is this thing of supportive relationships. And you'll see that coming through in every single thing when it comes to supporting children's well-being, emotional regulation, resilience. The key factor of supportive relationships with children and the impact that that has. So that brings us to the next level, and this is toxic stress. And this is where there is a prolonged activation of the stress response. And in the absence of protective relationships, and again, as somebody said, particularly in these times, because of all of the implications that the COVID restrictions have brought, and people being worried about financially, worrying about their health, worrying emotionally about themselves, family structures and lots of different systems have been more vulnerable. So that level of supportive relationships isn't necessarily always as good as it might have been or could be. But in addition to that, it's this ongoing sort of drip of stress that's going on. And it could be quite significant stresses in a home. So it can be down to neglect, it could be down to abuse, all of the really kind of significant adverse life experiences, or it could be down to just literally parents not getting on, or one parent having some health or mental health challenges. But it's something that is consistently dripping, and the child is not in a network of support that helps them to learn from that and to cope with it. And that's the area that we really are concerned about. My hope is with COVID that we see it as a tolerable stress situation for most children, and that they will come out of this being stronger and more capable. But for some, there's no doubt that this has been an ongoing, very stressful situation that has been more like toxic stress for a number of children and will take a while to recover from. Just a few points about the toxic stress. If it is ongoing, and particularly in the early years, it does have lifelong implications for behavior, learning, health, and this can be ongoing. But also, I suppose I like to highlight, the brain and our systems are all changing all of the time, and they're growing all the time. And even if somebody has had very negative life experiences earlier in life or for a particular period, there's always that potential for people to get back on track with the right support. And we've loads of examples of like really inspirational global leaders who have gone through incredibly difficult life experiences and turned that into something that has allowed them to have a really positive impact on the world, because they haven't got stuck or they've got the right support. And if you read the stories about these people, they will always mention the key people in their lives that helped them at different points, that got them to the next bit and the next bit. They never did it alone. And that's again why relationships are so important. As I said, if something happens of a stressful nature, but if the child has that supportive network around them and they can come back to base in the context of those relationships, then they can learn from it, and actually they can start to develop a healthy stress response system. That's why it's so important to allow children to be challenged, to go into beyond their comfort zone, because even though they're in that stretch zone and they're being challenged, when they come back to base in that zone, that's where they build up their confidence and their resilience. So it's really important that we allow them those opportunities, and we're there for them to guide and support them as they go along. And this is the toxic stress. So where it's extreme and long lasting and the relationships aren't there, it has huge implications. And Harvard defined trauma as the emotional, psychological, and physiological residue that's left from the heightened levels of toxic stress. So young people are particularly vulnerable to the effects of trauma, because particularly in the first 3 years of life, we know there is a rapid brain and neurological development. Something like 90% of the neural networks are formed up to about, I think it's the age of 3, or it could be 5. I think it is 3 though. Now, as I said, networks change all the time. We're learning all the time. So the brain is constantly evolving, but it's a very significant period of growth for the child development of the brain. So that's why we are particularly concerned when we know there's been trauma or ongoing toxic stress in the very early stages of life, even though obviously it has implications at any stage. So just as a question, would people feel there is more toxic stress? Are you seeing more examples of toxic stress and trauma in the last year than perhaps previously, or are things at a pretty much same level? Do you feel people are coping fairly well, or is this toxic stress having an impact on the young people you're working with? You're super. It's a very engaging group, and thank you so much. It's lovely to see the comments coming in. Much more, Robin. So you're seeing much more of this toxic stress and the trauma that's coming in. Wonderful. Not wonderful, obviously, but it's great to see that it's along the same lines. Yeah. More trauma-like responses Too early to tell, Joanna. Yeah, I mean, the schools are only back a few weeks and it is difficult to really get a full sense of it. For the staff as well, a great tolerance levels are much lower. I think one of the biggest feedback I've had from schools is that exact point, that tolerance with their peers, tolerance with teachers, tolerance with frustration, that level, that window of tolerance is much lower than it would have been in the past. That's absolutely true. Staff are experiencing it as well. It manifests in many forms. There's definitely increased levels. I'm seeing a lot of students are having issues with panic attacks and generalized anxiety. Joe, I completely agree. And that's something that's coming through for us as well. A lot more in different ways. Anxiety is high because it's high stress. I'm seeing a higher need in children that would normally have been able to cope and manage, absolutely. Have to be together all the time with no release, and there's many complex issues which are arising, which will lead to long-term effects. And I think that's going to be something that's going to stay with us, as you say, Delia, for a while. We're going to have to keep an eye on this and upskill ourselves and learn ourselves the tools and strategies that we can offer and model for young people, because they need us now more than ever. So high level of need in children as well. Great. So you're living this as educators in schools. You're seeing all of these children coming into the school and you see what they're coping with. And as somebody said, it's early days for some. For others, you can really see the impact fairly quickly. And so I suppose what's important to bring us back to is typically what would normal, or if you like, where there isn't this trauma or this extra stress to be dealt with, what do we expect to see in a person who has had the opportunity to have a relatively good development trajectory is the word I was going to use. What do we see in people who haven't had to deal with significant levels of stress or trauma? So the first thing is they typically reliably see the world in a fairly objective way. So that's where, I suppose, with the trauma lens, any kind of trigger in the environment that sets off the alarm, that can make us all or nothing. It can be very much about kind of seeing everything as a threat. For example, I use the example of a door slamming. If I'm here talking to you and a door goes bang, well, then I can usually kind of have a look and say, oh, I wonder, is a window open? What's happening? For somebody who's experienced trauma and where that noise has been linked to a situation, even something they may not even remember, but has been embedded in their brain, that could signify a very significant trigger and could lead to a really extreme response to something that, you know, most people would say, it's the door banging, I must close the window, I must make sure that when it's windy, I don't leave the doors open. So that's the difference between somebody who can bring that thinking brain online, oh, there's a bang. Okay, what was it? Let's see what I can do about it, to somebody who hears that bang and just completely flips the lid, as we said. Again, if we haven't had these extra demands, we can problem solve and plan for the future in a flexible way. So it's not, again, not all or nothing. We don't have to control everything. It's like if something doesn't work out and we're disappointed, we can say, okay, well, what else can we do? Or, you know, what would I do the next time? That ability to be able to be flexible in our thinking and not be stuck on one idea or another, or that all or nothing idea. The other thing is that we can recognize a range of emotions. So we can feel disappointed and we can tolerate that. Something was cancelled we were really looking forward to, but we can name that and we can say, okay, I am really disappointed and I can hold that, but it doesn't consume me and I don't react from that. So I'm able to regulate, name and regulate. And that's really, really tricky, especially for the feelings like grief, for anger, for frustration, for disappointment, for sadness. You know, it can be difficult for anybody to actually be willing to sit and tolerate and just be with those feelings, you know, even as adults. But it's really, really important, and especially as we're supporting children who have no tolerance for anything that goes beyond sort of just feeling okay, or, you know, at a baseline of happy. So we need to understand that these things can be really challenging. The other thing is that we can develop a good sense of self-identity. So we kind of know who we are, and we know that we're capable of achieving things, and that, you know, we can set goals and work towards them, as opposed to kind of not really knowing who I am. I'm so stressed and I'm so reactive that I've actually lost touch with who I am really. And I'm so busy and there's so much energy going into just trying to control my environment to feel safe, that I don't have the skills or capacity left to, you know, make good choices or plan for the future or think about what I want, because I'm so embedded in needing to stay safe here and now. And if we haven't had that experience of attachment issues or trauma related issues, then we can form trusting relationships. And again, it's back to this key of relationships with people who can help us out, who we can go to when we're having these feelings and talk to, where we can name what's going on for us and know that somebody will be there to listen to us. We can trust them and we can feel vulnerable, as opposed to feeling we have to be putting on a performance or we have to deal with things on our own because people aren't reliable and I can't trust them. So as I mentioned, the early childhood trauma piece is quite significant. It's something that rightly gets a lot of research attention and we're learning more about. And the early childhood trauma happens in the crucible of the early critical relationships, and this can have devastating effects on the development. So where the trauma or the stressor is related to, I suppose, abuse or any negative life experiences that relate to other people, particularly we should have been able to trust them, or we did trust them and that trust was violated, that really ruptures us at our core. And we are social creatures, we're wired to connect. But where that has been disrupted, that has significant effects on all aspects of development. Now, I'm not going to go through this. I will be sending the slides and the recording for this, so you have all of this. But it's just to show how wide-reaching trauma can be on every level, on our thinking, on our physical health, on emotional health, on social and emotional, our mental health, on behavior, and on the brain development. And it's just recognizing that it underlines every aspect of our being. And that's why it's not simple, in terms of addressing all of these areas. And for young people and for children who are, and adults even, who've gone through really traumatic experiences, it's a process that needs to be followed, and it takes time, and it often takes learning and relearning and understanding yourself in terms of what role can I play to support them? How can I develop the skills and the strategies so that I can be the best place to support somebody who's really struggling on all of these levels? And seeing that behavior in particular is the only way often that a young person or child can communicate what is going on. And as I said, the language part of our brain is up here in the thinking brain. But if we're sitting down at the lower parts of our brain, we don't have access to the words to explain what's going on. We don't have access to the capacity to reflect on what we've done or to critically think. And so behavior is often the only way, the only means we have to communicate what's going on for us. And just summing up on this, 3 critical impacts that have been found from childhood trauma is that the emotional brain becomes a survival brain. So as I said, it's the 2 lower parts of the brain become interconnected, and it's all about perceiving threat and reacting to situations. And that's what the person, their life becomes almost. It's that just having to be vigilant, having to watch out, and then reacting. The hypervigilance for danger. So because we're so busy, we're looking out for something that may happen, we can't connect with what's actually happening and access the resources we have to deal effectively with whatever's in front of us. And then it's very difficult to learn from experiences. And this is why young people or children or even adults say, how can they do the same thing every time? Do they not learn that doesn't work, or that leads to bad consequences? Or the reality is, no, they're not in the space for being able to learn. That's why if children don't feel safe and don't feel connected, the learning just doesn't happen. Bottom levels have to be in place. The foundation has to be in place. And they use this phrase of Velcro, where something will stick. So if I'm feeling safe and connected and I can learn from you, then I will remember things. But if I'm in a situation of stress and high anxiety, then whatever you say in that moment is just going to bounce off me like Teflon. So it's that idea that actually for things to stick and to learn and to move on, we need to be in that space of connected with other people and feeling safe. Otherwise, we do get into this loop of the same behaviors, which is very challenging. It's very energy draining for people trying to support a young person or a child. We feel like we've done everything, we've listened to them, we've gone through the whole book, and still they find it difficult to regulate. It really is something that needs to go right back to the beginning, back to forming that relationship. And it's a process, as I said, that doesn't happen overnight, particularly depending on the child's trauma or what they've been through. But the real key skill, and that's why the Emotional Resilience course focuses on this, is about you having the skills and the tools to develop your resilience so you're better able to cope and support, rather than burning out and getting drained by dealing with something that is so difficult for anybody to deal with. So just another lovely resource in the Beacon House explaining this whole survival loop and how we can get stuck in being hypervigilant, and where normal cues can feel dangerous, and how we get stuck in the fight, flight and freeze response. There's a lovely video on YouTube that's about 5 minutes that kind of pulls all this together, and it's kind of an animation that I think is lovely for you to watch, but also to share with the young people that you're working with as well. So it's something I'll send on as part of the resources after this webinar that might be useful. Just going to take a sip of water. Can I check, is everybody with me? Is there any questions or comments at this stage? Great. Perfect. Great, guys. You're still with me. That's all I need to know. So at its root or at its core, trauma undermines our sense of safety and our ability to trust. And again, this is back to why relationships are just so important. And I know, so as we say, safe, trusting relationships play a key role and they help in the recovery from trauma. So I know a lot of you would probably know about and heard about Lemon Sissy. I've only come across in the last couple of years. From this morning session, one of the carers got back in touch and said that actually Lemon Sissy did a workshop in Surrey, our first Surrey Council, a number of years ago. It was really inspirational. I think his work is fantastic. And he has been through the care experiences as well.
There, if you don't mind, a quick question there in your comments.
Yeah, I see that there. So Stephen, I was just interested in how many times the brain changes in young people. Our brain is changing every single day. Every single day. So neural networks have been formed and are being either solidified or changed every single day. So every time we're presented with new information, something happens. However, as I said, when the brain is in lockdown, when it's just using all of its capacity just to survive the present moment, then their ability to form new networks and to form new stages of learning is really inhibited. So yeah, we learn every day. The brain changes every day. It's just how much we can learn in a given time depends on our capacity and our openness to learning. So interesting how many times the brain changes in young people with malleability. Again, we're so adaptable and flexible, and malleable is the word, that the brain is constantly rewiring and looking at new situations. So Lemon Sissy did a wonderful, the way I came across him was this wonderful documentary he did on Channel 4 a few years ago, which is still there. And if you can watch it, I would highly recommend it. And he takes these 5 young people who have been through the care process and he helps them to use poetry and writing to express what their experience was like and to be able to communicate that. And these amazing inspirational young people got to a point where they presented their poetry and their very personal, intimate thoughts and feelings to a huge auditorium of really big decision makers, people from the council, their family, their friends, other people from the community. And they were all absolutely inspirational is the word. There was one piece in particular that I just like to bring in this when we talk about relationships. And it was actually this young lad, second from the right. And during his poem, he addresses his carer. And it seems that this carer probably came on board in his life only the last couple of years. But just to show you the impact that we can have at any stage of a child's life, it doesn't have to be early on necessarily. It doesn't have to be for a very long period of time. But when somebody is really attuned and understands trauma and the effect it can have, then the very simple things can really work. So this is a part of his poem that he wrote, and they had the screen on the care at the time, and it was just so powerful. And he said, "My heart was ready to blow up, but I'm with a carer now. She's different, she cares. I call her mum sometimes. If I'm on one, she shuts the living room door and we have a calm conversation. She knows how to do safe bomb disposal of my heart. Since meeting her, the anger in my heart has halved down to 50%. The other half of my heart is now full of happiness because of her." So when we think about the parts of the brain and the relationship and what's going on here, there's so much that this carer is doing in a very natural way. So she recognizes when that young person is at that point of flipping the lid. So when I'm ready to blow, when I'm on one, as he says, he trusts her enough to go into a safe space and to close the door. And he's able to regulate enough to be able to access that thinking brain so we can have a conversation. And the impact of having a relationship like that with somebody who understands me, who I trust, who I feel safe enough with to talk about what's going on, has literally changed his capacity to connect with the happiness within himself, whereas before he only felt anger. So it's just showing the kind of impact that can be done with really simple things, simple but not easy, when you're supporting somebody who is, very liable to flip their lid at any moment. But it can be done. And it's the qualities of that carer, who is just obviously an amazing woman, and her capacity to connect and tune in and to create that sense of safety with that young person. So looking at that, it's again, what that young person learned was, number one, they're safe. That person is there with them and we can find a solution. And that's the process which you build up with a young person over time. And by you having the skills and the capacity and the self-awareness and the self-regulation skills to be able to get into that space with the young person where they naturally know that you are safe with them, you care about them, and that you are there for them, and that you're there to work with them to figure out what you can do. And this is a model from Bruce Perry, who again is another neuroscientist who developed the Child Trauma Institute in the States. And he talks about the 3 R's. So once we can regulate, help them feel safe and that there isn't a threat. Once we can relate with them, we form that attachment and we help them to know we're here, then we can reason. So this model permeates lots of different frameworks and is really, really useful in understanding your role as an educator, for foster carers, for parents, for social workers, anybody who is supporting that child and who's working in the network that's connected with that child. So we have a few minutes left, and I just want to explain about the Emotional Resilience Programme a little bit more that Surrey Virtual School have funded. So they have funded a number of packages for foster carers and for some educators who are interested in doing a level 1 course, looking at some of these areas, but exploring it a little bit further. So just to explain, the level 1 feeds into an overall program, which is called DESTY Island, which is an emotional resilience online program. It's a curriculum that children work through with the DESTY mentor. And there's 2 parts to that training. The level 1 is setting the foundation, understanding trauma, attachment, the brain, emotional intelligence and emotional regulation skills. And then from that, if people finish that course and they want to move on, there's the possibility of becoming trained to actually implement the DESTY Island program. And there's 3 core modules in the DESTY Island program. So the first one is about me. So this is represented by the avatar the young person builds. The second one then is my feelings tower, and that's where they're building emotional vocabulary and emotional intelligence. And then the workshop is where it relates to their ability to develop their emotional resilience. So now that I feel safe with you and I've learned about myself and I can work with you, now that I know a little bit more about my feelings and I can unpack them, now I can start to work through them and develop action plans and very specific things that are related personally to me of what would work for me. So it is all connected and linked to this neuroscience of the brain, helping them feel safe, helping them understand their feelings and working out what they can do in the moment when something arises. As I mentioned, the level 1 course is about setting the foundation for that and giving you a taste of the DESTY Island a little bit towards the end, but also having those foundational skills, and it stands alone. So doing this course on its own is about giving you practical resources and practical skills that you can start using straight away. As soon as you learn something, you can start to implement it. The good thing about it's online and self-paced. So it's made up of about 51 bite-sized videos, so between 3 and 7 or 9 minutes each. And that means you can dip in and out as much as you need to. So if you have 20 minutes free, you can go in, you can do it. It's all video based and very interactive. So it's really about getting you involved, as I said, and getting you to practice the practical elements of it. There's resources and worksheets and then a certificate of completion. And this is the first step then to becoming the certified DESTY mentor and having the wider package available. As part of the level 1, there's a toolkit that comes with it. And I know for some of you might be working with slightly older children, but these are really useful toolkits to have in a school anyway. So the DESTY Teddy is there that connects the learning and the little videos we do around mindfulness and belly breathing and senses exercise. And there's a little pocket in the back for the wishes and worries. So everybody on the course gets one of those, and also a set of feeling cards, which extends the emotional vocabulary out to 26 feeling words, where you start with 6 on the island and then they're expanded and generalized to 26. So it's all about building those emotional literacy skills, which I believe are even more important than your, I suppose, standard literacy skills. They should be taught first for me when it comes to building children's social and emotional development. Stephen, would this course be appropriate for 16 plus? The one thing I would say, this is just, I pulled out, I didn't have this for the carers this morning, but I said I better get just one feedback that would kind of encapsulate what somebody got from this course. So I thought this was useful and might answer that. The DESTY Emotional Resilience Programme provided me with invaluable and easy to understand information about emotional resilience from the start. It has developed my own emotional resilience and has given me the tools to empower the children I work with to become more resilient in their everyday lives. The consistent feedback I get about this course is what people personally and professionally get from it. So it's about us building our emotional resilience toolkit so that we can be the role models and have the skills and strategies to share and to teach children and young people So a lot of the content in the course is what I felt I needed to learn and what I felt I needed to put into practice so that I could regulate and so that I could, make more intelligent decisions and be more resilient. So the course itself is aimed at you developing the skills so you can pass them on to family members, to teenagers, to younger people. Now, the DESTY Island program is definitely pitched at a younger age than 16 plus. We often talk about the emotional age as opposed to cognitive age. So some young people, the first young person I worked with was 12, very streetwise, didn't know if he would engage, but he did actually love it because it's one-to-one. And they have the opportunity to go through it with somebody that they form a relationship with and that they trust. But the resilience course is really about anybody. That's another feedback we got. Exactly, if you're starting off, Stephen, it's exactly it. So the idea is that you're learning the foundational skills of what it means to build these relationships and to pass on these resilience skills. I'm not sure how we're doing on time.